Hello, my name is Zara and I'm a Senior Executive at the Anti-Fraud Charity Fraud Advisory Panel. I'm delighted to be joined today by Sophie Brown, a counter-fraud specialist at BDO, to discuss the result of our recent charity fraud survey. The survey was conducted by Fraud Advisory Panel and BDO in September 2021. Sophie will highlight the key findings of the survey, some of the emerging risks that we identified, and conclude with a couple of practical tips to help you protect your charity against fraud. So, before we dive into the research, it is worth noting that the purpose of the survey was to understand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the sector, how it has affected the fraud landscape for charities, and to determine what we can do to better protect charities against fraud. We also wanted to compare charities' experiences of managing the evolving risk of fraud before, during, and after the pandemic. Sophie, I'll now hand over to you. What were some of the most interesting findings that came out of the research?
I think the most interesting findings were in relation to how charities are responding to instances of fraud and the financial investment of fraud prevention among the sector. Firstly, of the charities who experienced a fraud in the past 12 months, it was particularly positive that 82% acted through applying sanctions, seeking redress, or reporting to the authorities, and in some instances, a combination of them all. So this sends a clear message to potential fraudsters that charities are committed to combating fraud and are prepared to take relevant steps to ensure perpetrators are held accountable. Sometimes organisations are hesitant to take the relevant steps due to concerns about reputational damage from adverse media reports and or the financial costs of an investigation. However, taking action against fraudsters acts as a really powerful deterrent to anyone looking to target the sector. In addition, there could be other negative consequences of not taking action, including an adverse impact on future funding if a clear message is not communicated to stakeholders and donors regarding the organisation's stance on fraud. And similarly, it may send a negative message to employees and volunteers, which could damage morale. Secondly, the results highlighted that 60% of all respondents' financial investment has stayed the same since the pandemic. So what was interesting about this statistic was that most respondents believe that the pandemic has increased the risk of fraud to their charity. And of these respondents, 79% of them stated that their financial investment in fraud prevention has not changed prior to the pandemic. So this shows that despite the perceived increase of fraud risk, the level of financial investment in fraud prevention has not been matched to reflect this risk, which could lead to charities being more vulnerable to fraud. Also, the results show that 14% of all respondents don't invest in fraud prevention at all. This isn't particularly surprising, as we understand that it's not always possible for charities to invest financially in a dedicated fraud role or function, as budgets and income can be stretched and additionally could have been negatively impacted by the pandemic. However, our survey has highlighted that 67% of those who do not financially invest in fraud prevention are charities with an income exceeding £500,000 annually and are therefore one of the higher income brackets. However, it is important to emphasise that 86% of the charities surveyed do financially invest in fraud prevention, which suggests that the fraud risks have been considered and are proactively being looked at. However, it is the level of fraud prevention that may not be sufficient in mitigating all the risks brought about since the pandemic. Therefore, it's important that your charity considers whether your level of fraud prevention is enough. We also encourage financial investment in fraud prevention as it's the most effective mechanism in protecting your charity against fraud. Being proactive in preventing fraud occurring in the first place, rather than being reactive, is the most effective way to protect your charity. Having a solely reactive approach to fraud will actually cost your charity more than it would from investing in fraud prevention measures. And in some cases, the losses due to fraud, including the costs of investigating the fraud, cannot be recovered. It's not only the financial impact which would be felt if a fraud is suffered, it could be the loss of end user confidence, withdrawal of grants and funding, damage to team morale, job losses, diversion of management time and regulatory sanctions. However, we do understand that your charity may have been significantly impacted by the pandemic on a financial level, and therefore it's not been possible to increase your financial investment in fraud prevention. However, there are still measures which can be undertaken to ensure that the type of fraud prevention you currently invest in is still applicable and effective. And we'll share these in our top tips section later.
Thank you, Sophie. That's really interesting. And it's really positive to hear that 86% of charities who responded to this survey actually financially invest in fraud prevention. Definitely, as the saying goes, prevention is better than cure. Can I ask, were there any findings that surprised you from the survey?
I was particularly surprised about the types of fraud which the sector's been facing since the pandemic. The most common frauds experienced in the last 12 months were payment diversion fraud and theft of cash or assets, which isn't shocking. However, what was interesting was that after these two highest fraud types, the type of fraud experience was very consistent across other areas identified, as financial reporting, procurement fraud, CEO fraud, card testing fraud, and fake beneficiary fraud. So what could this mean? It stresses the point that fraud prevention cannot solely be targeted in one area, such as the usual high-risk areas of finance or procurement, as fraudsters are now targeting a variety of areas and controls, perhaps testing where the weakest links are or testing where the greatest opportunities lie. The disruption that we faced over the last 18 months, whether from shifting working patterns, working remotely, increased demand for services, or stretched resources due to staff illness, will have, of course, impacted your charity in one way or another, which may have caused once effective controls to now be ineffective. Or perhaps staff were given new roles and responsibilities, but were not appropriately trained. It's said that a control is only as effective as the person who's operating it. So have you recently reviewed your control environment to determine whether the controls are in place, understood by staff, and could they be bypassed? Another factor which stood out was that of those charities who suffered a fraud since the pandemic, there was an equal split between perpetrators being an internal threat, i.e. a member of staff, or an external threat, i.e. a person with no connection to the charity. This also emphasises the level of vigilance which is needed, as it's often those with no connection to the charity who are deemed as the largest threats by the media, the anonymous fraudster lurking in the darkness looking for an opportunity. However, charity experiences have indicated otherwise. In my opinion, to reduce the risk of internal fraud, focus should be placed on educating staff to spot potential red flags of fraud. Your staff are on the ground in all aspects of your operations, and they are the eyes and ears of the organisation and are best placed to spot if something doesn't look quite right, and will more than likely spot fraud more quickly than if it was identified, for example, by an audit at a later date. Also, staff are the gatekeepers to your charity's finances, assets, and information. So therefore, by honing your staff's fraud risk management tools, by increasing their fraud awareness and promoting an anti-fraud culture, you will enhance not only the control environment against internal fraudsters, but external fraudsters too.
That's really interesting, Sophie. And it really highlights the fact that the sector must be aware of the threat to their charity, both inside and out. So let's dive into some of the practical things that charities can do. Sophie, what were your 6 top tips for charities to help them prevent fraud?
Firstly, implement an anti-fraud policy. Set out clearly your organisation's stance on fraud in simple and easy to understand terms. Your anti-fraud policy should include, but not be limited to, a definition of fraud, key risk areas identified in your fraud risk assessment, strategic and operational responsibilities for each relevant party, for example, trustees, senior management, staff, volunteers, reporting requirements, including reference to a whistleblowing policy, and a fraud response plan. Secondly, implement a fraud awareness training plan or provide refreshers to all staff. Your staff are your eyes and ears, as said before, and according to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners and other more recent studies, tip-offs or whistleblower reports from within the organisation account for nearly 50% of all detected fraud, therefore highlighting the importance of this. I'd also suggest performing an up-to-date fraud risk assessment. Controls and processes are ever evolving and changing, therefore it's important to understand your current risk areas, which may have changed since the pandemic, or perhaps you have upcoming changes which will require a risk assessment. Also, encourage dialogue about fraud among your senior management to ensure that fraud risk management is being proactively discussed. Having a clear fraud strategy that is communicated clearly by leadership is key in driving an anti-fraud culture. Providing an open environment where senior management and staff can discuss fraud freely will support this. Also, ensure you test your fraud response plan. Often, fraud response plans are in place but have never been tested, and it would be catastrophic if it was found to be ineffective only at the point of suffering a fraud. This, coupled with uncovering fraud, could cause delays, resulting in further losses, those involved being able to cover up their fraudulent activity, or result in inadequate evidence handling, which could then cause the case to be thrown out of court, causing difficulties in trying to recover funds which have been lost. Finally, I suggest review the amount that you invest in fraud prevention and consider whether it's sufficient and whether your fraud strategy encompasses your specific fraud risks.
Those are some great tips, Sophie, and there's a wealth of guidance available on the preventcharityfraud.org.uk website to help you take these important steps. So with a crystal ball in front of you, What do you see as the next big threat in the fraud landscape over the next 12 months?
I think that fraud, or at least attempted fraud, will continue to increase, as has been the trend for a number of years now. We just need to be smarter in how we deal with it. New fraud threats are emerging all the time, but one thing will always remain the same. Where you have anything of value, whether that's cash, assets, information, there will be someone, including someone that you know and trust, that will try and deprive you of that value for a myriad of reasons. That being said, I would like to mention innovations in technology here, because this will certainly impact the types of fraud that charities will face. With a move towards an increased level of technology, remote working, and automated processes, it's becoming easier for fraudsters to infiltrate systems and perpetrate frauds. One thing we can be sure of is that fraudsters are continually investing in technological advancements and developing new ways to perpetrate sophisticated fraud schemes, and we need to keep up with those advances. However, fraudsters need information, and they can achieve this through phishing attacks and social engineering, and we need to educate our staff to protect our organisation from this kind of external threat. Cyber and ransomware attacks are also on the increase and will remain a key threat. Therefore, staying one step ahead of fraudsters here will remain important, and I would point towards checking IT security and controls and whether they are fit for purpose, and consider investment in new IT systems where you identify deficiencies. So having said all of the above, my final piece of advice would be to keep it simple. Know the risks, assess the risks, and make a plan to counter those risks. Even the most sophisticated organisations can fall victim to fraud, whether internally or externally. But understanding the pressure points will go a long way to mitigating those risks.
Thank you, Sophie. And to those listening, we've hoped that you found these insights from our recent survey useful and informative. Our report is available from the resources section of our website, preventcharityfraud.org.uk. Here you will also find a number of other resources to help you prevent, detect and respond to fraud. Our special thanks go to everyone who took part in the Charity Fraud Survey and shared their insights with us. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.